The march had begun under a pale midday sun, but now the sun was long gone, replaced by a thick blanket of cloud that hid the stars and made the darkness feel even deeper. You and your company had been walking for hours along roads that cut through the quiet Prussian countryside, roads made of hard-packed earth and loose stones that shifted under your boots with every step. The day's heat had faded into a cool evening, and then that coolness had sharpened into the distinct chill of a late autumn night, the kind that seeps through wool and leather and settles in your bones if you stand still too long. But you had not stood still. You had kept moving one foot after the other, the steady rhythm of the march lulling you into a sort of trance that made the miles blur together. Fields of stubble and turned soil stretched away on either side of the road, their details lost to the gloom, and every so often you passed a farmhouse with a single candle burning in a window, a tiny point of warmth that seemed impossibly far away. The villages you moved through were dark and silent, their inhabitants long asleep, and even the dogs had stopped barking, as if they understood that this was not a night for noise. You were not alone in your weariness. The entire column of men around you shared the same heavy-limbed fatigue, the same quiet acceptance of the road's demands. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say after a full day of marching, and the only sounds were the scuff and crunch of boots, the occasional jingle of a buckle, the soft rustle of wool coats rubbing against cartridge boxes. The air smelled of dry earth and distant wood smoke, and a faint dampness rose from the ditches where last week's rain still lingered, reminding you that the season was turning toward winter. You adjusted the strap of your musket where it pressed into your shoulder, the familiar ache, a constant companion, and you let your gaze fall to the heels of the man in front of you, watching the way his gaiters had come slightly undone at the back. This small detail occupied your mind for a long stretch of road, a way to pass the time without thinking about how far you still had to go or when you might finally stop. Then, without any signal that you could see, the column began to slow. It was a gradual change, a lengthening of the gaps between men, a softening of the collective footfall, until the word came back in low murmurs that you were to halt here for the night. Here, as it turned out, was a meadow just off the road, a wide open space of trampled grass, and at its center stood a large hay barn, its dark silhouette rising against the slightly lighter sky. The barn was built in the old timber frame style, with great oak beams visible even from a distance, and its roof sloped down low on both sides, giving it the appearance of a resting animal. A few outbuildings huddled nearby, but the barn itself was the only structure that mattered now, because it promised shelter from the wind that had begun to pick up, rustling the dry grasses and tugging at the brims of hats. The officer in charge, a tired-looking man with a voice worn thin by years of command, rode slowly along the line and told the men to take their rest inside, quietly, without fuss, and to be ready to move again at first light. His words were barely above a whisper, and they floated through the air like leaves, settling on ears that were too tired to do anything but obey. You turned off the road with the others and walked across the meadow toward the barn, your legs feeling suddenly heavier now that the march was over, as if they had been holding themselves together for just this moment and could now finally admit their exhaustion. The grass underfoot was damp with dew, and your boots left dark prints that quickly filled with shadow. The barn loomed larger as you approached, its wooden walls weathered to a silvery grey, and you could see that its great double doors were already open just wide enough for men to slip through one at a time. A faint light flickered from somewhere inside, maybe a shielded lantern or the last embers of a fire the farmers had left, but it was too dim to reveal any details, just enough to guide you toward the entrance. The air near the barn was different from the open meadow. It was stiller, heavier, carrying the sweet and dusty scent of old hay that had been stored for months, a smell that spoke of summer cuttings and long afternoons of labor, now long past. As you reached the doors, you paused for a moment to let the men ahead of you pass inside, and you listened to the soft sounds that came from within, the rustle of straw being disturbed, the creak of old timbers settling, the low murmur of tired voices finding their places. Then it was your turn, and you stepped over the threshold into a darkness so complete that for a heartbeat you could see nothing at all. Your boots met a floor of packed earth, hard and uneven, and you felt the slight give of scattered hay beneath your heels. The doors creaked softly behind you as the last men entered and pulled them mostly closed, leaving only a narrow gap through which the night air could still slip, carrying the clean scent of the meadow and the distant promise of morning. The barn was vast, far larger than it had looked from outside, and the darkness gave it an endless quality, as if the walls were merely suggestions rather than solid boundaries. High above, you could sense the presence of the roof beams, and you knew there was a hayloft up there, but for now the space around you was all that mattered. You stood still for a long moment, letting your eyes adjust, and slowly the darkness began to differentiate into shades of black and grey. You could make out the shapes of your comrades as they moved through the barn, dark figures against a slightly less dark background, bending and settling like birds coming to roost. The air inside was noticeably warmer than the meadow, insulated by the thick walls and the great mass of hay, and it wrapped around you like a heavy cloak, carrying with it the faint, almost imperceptible scent of animals that had once been stabled here. Cows, perhaps, their presence now only a ghost in the wood and straw. You inhaled deeply, and the dust in the air tickled the back of your throat, but it was a gentle irritation, the kind that reminds you that you are indoors, sheltered, safe from the wind. You began to move through the barn, stepping carefully so as not to disturb the men already stretched out on the floor, and you looked for a spot where you might lay your own pack and rest. The darkness made the search slow, and you used your hands to feel the walls and the partitions that divided the space into smaller sections, each one filled with hay in various states of compression. Your fingers brushed against rough-hewn wood, splintery in places, and you traced the edges of a stall until you found a corner near a wooden partition that felt both private and protected. Here the hay was piled deeper, as if it had been pushed aside by previous occupants, and there was enough room for you to stretch out fully without touching anyone else. You let your pack slide from your shoulders, and it landed with a soft thud, the canvas worn and stained from the day's march. You leaned your musket against the partition, its barrel cool to the touch, and you removed your tricorn hat, setting it gently on top of the pack where it would not be crushed. All around you, the barn was filling with the quiet sounds of men preparing for sleep. Greatcoats were being spread on the hay with a soft whisking noise, and equipment was being loosened and set aside with a faint clink of metal on metal. A soldier nearby unrolled his blanket, and the wool made a dry, rasping sound as it settled over the straw. Someone coughed once, a low, muffled sound quickly swallowed by the darkness, and then silence flowed back in, like water filling a depression in the ground. There was no talking now, just the unspoken understanding that the day was over, and that rest was the only thing worth pursuing. You found this collective quiet deeply soothing, a reminder that you were not alone in your fatigue, that everyone around you was sinking into the same soft surrender. You lowered yourself onto the hay, feeling it crunch and yield beneath your weight, and you took a moment to arrange your body in a way that would ease the soreness from your muscles. You stretched your legs out fully, pointing your toes to lengthen your calves, and then you let them fall loose, feeling the tension drain away. Your back, which had been held straight for so many hours, now curved into the hay's uneven support, and you arched it slightly to find the most comfortable position, hearing the straw crackle in response. The hay was not soft in the way a mattress is soft, but it had a forgiving quality, a willingness to adapt to the shape of your body, and you were grateful for it. You placed your hands behind your head and looked up into the absolute darkness above, where the roof beams were hidden, and you let your breathing slow. The scent of the hay was stronger now that you were surrounded by it, a dry and almost sweet perfume made up of 100 different grasses and clovers, all of them dried and pressed together into a single fragrance. It was the smell of a summer that had been captured and stored, and it filled your lungs with every breath, gradually replacing the memory of the road and the dust and the chill wind. The air in the barn was so still that the dust motes you could not see hung suspended, and the only movement was the slow rise and fall of chests as the men around you drifted closer to sleep. You listened to the breathing, a chorus of different rhythms, some deep and slow, others still a little uneven as their owners struggled to let go of the day. The barn itself had its own voice, a quiet symphony of creaks and groans as the timbers adjusted to the change in temperature, releasing the tension of the day just as the men were releasing theirs. You closed your eyes, and the darkness behind your lids was no different from the darkness of the barn, a seamless continuation of the night. The road, the fields, the villages, all of it had dissolved into this single point of stillness, and you felt your mind beginning to loosen its grip on the details of the day. You no longer needed to remember the exact curve of the road, or the face of the woman at the gate, or the taste of the water from the stream. Those images were already fading, becoming soft and unfocused, like a reflection in rippling water. What remained was the present moment. The feel of the hay against your neck, the sound of a man turning over a few feet away, the faint draft of cool air that found its way through the gap in the doors and brushed against your cheek like a farewell from the outside world. You could feel the weight of your uniform still on your body, but it no longer felt like a burden. The dark blue wool coat, unbuttoned now at the collar, was simply another layer between you and the hay, a familiar texture that had been with you through so many miles that it had become a second skin. The crossbelts lay loosened across your chest, their white leather darkened by sweat and time, and they rose and fell with every breath. A gentle reminder that you were a soldier, yes, but right now, in this moment, you were simply a man at rest. The hay accepted this, accepted you, without judgment or demand, and the barn held you all in its dark embrace, a silent guardian over the sleeping company. Time became difficult to measure as you lay there, suspended between the day that had ended and the sleep that was approaching. You were not yet asleep, but you were no longer fully awake either, drifting in a state of deep relaxation that made your limbs feel heavy and warm. The coolness of the night was still present at the edges of your awareness, but it could not reach you here, wrapped as you were in wool and hay and the collective warmth of so many bodies. You thought of the march again, but only as a distant echo, a memory of motion that made this stillness all the more precious. You turned onto your side, curling slightly into the hay, and the straw shifted to accommodate this new shape, filling the spaces around your hips and shoulders as if it had been waiting for you to settle, just so. The rustling sound it made was a soft shushing noise, like a mother quieting a child, and you let it lull you further away from wakefulness. The barn's darkness was no longer empty. It had become a presence in its own right, a comforting weight that pressed gently on your eyelids and filled your ears with a silence that was not really silence at all, but a tapestry of tiny sounds. A mouse scratched somewhere in a distant corner, and the wind outside whispered against the planks, and far off a night bird called once before falling quiet. All of it blended into a seamless backdrop, a lullaby woven from the ordinary fabric of a rural night. You felt your breathing synchronize with the slow rhythm of the barn, each inhale drawing in the dusty sweetness, each exhale releasing a little more of the day's tension. Your hands, which had been clenched earlier without you realizing it, now lay open and relaxed, the fingers slightly curled, resting on the hay as if they had found exactly what they were looking for. In the last moments before sleep would fully claim you, your mind drifted through a series of gentle images, none of them connected, all of them peaceful. You saw the poplar trees along the road, their leaves fluttering silver in the breeze, and the small stream where you had knelt to drink, the water so cold it made your teeth ache. You saw the barn from the outside, as if you were watching yourself from the meadow, its roof a dark triangle against the sky, a thin wisp of smoke rising from somewhere behind it. And then you saw nothing at all, just the soft, featureless darkness that was the inside of your own closed eyes, a darkness that asked nothing of you and promised nothing except rest. The barn held you in that darkness, the hay cradled you, and the sound of your comrades' breathing wove itself into a net that caught you gently, preventing you from falling too fast, allowing you to sink inch by inch toward the depths of sleep. You were a Prussian infantryman in a hay barn before dawn, and the world outside could wait. Now that you were still, and the initial relief of lying down had passed, your attention turned to the substance that was holding you, the hay itself. It was not the fresh green hay of early summer, the kind that still carries the juice of life in its stems and smells almost like cut grass on a lawn. This hay had been stored in the barn for months, ever since the last great cutting of the season, and it had dried to a pale golden brown, the color of toast or autumn leaves left too long in the sun. You reached out a hand and let your fingers trail through the loose pile beside you, feeling the individual stalks slide against your skin, each one distinct and separate, and yet part of a greater whole that shifted with a soft rustling sound. Some of the stalks were long and unbroken, still round and hollow like tiny tubes, while others had shattered into smaller pieces during the baling and stacking, creating a fine chaff that was almost powdery. This chaff clung to your fingers and the cuffs of your coat, a pale dust that glowed faintly in the absolute darkness, though you could not see it. You could only feel its dry, slightly abrasive texture. You lifted a handful and let it fall slowly back onto the pile, watching the way the stalks separated in the air, each one catching the faintest movement of the barn's still atmosphere before settling. The hay made a soft ticking sound as it landed, a series of tiny impacts that merged into a whisper. It was dry, yes, so dry that it crackled at the slightest pressure, but it was not harsh or unwelcoming. There was a surprising softness to it when taken as a whole, a collective give that cushioned your body in a way that individual stalks could not have achieved alone. You pressed your palm down into the pile, and the hay compressed with a long creaking sigh, the sound of 1,000 tiny fibers bending and sliding against one another. When you lifted your hand, the depression remained for a moment before slowly filling in again, the hay springing back not quite to its original shape, but close enough that the memory of your touch was soon erased. You decided to gather a thicker mound to serve as a pillow, and you began to scoop the hay toward you with both arms, pulling it into a loose heap near the top of your resting place. The stalks rasped against your sleeves, and the chaff dusted the backs of your hands, tickling slightly but not unpleasantly. You worked slowly, without hurry, because there was no reason to rush. The night was long, and the barn was still, and every small action was part of the process of settling in. You tamped the mound down with your palm, pressing firmly to compress the hay into a shape that would support your head and neck. It took several attempts, because the hay wanted to slide away or form lumps, but eventually you shaped a low, rounded cushion that felt roughly right. You tested it by lowering your head onto it, and the hay crackled loudly in your ear, a noise so close and immediate that it filled your entire world for a moment. The pillow was not soft like a feather cushion, but it had a springy quality, lifting your head just enough to keep your neck from bending awkwardly, and the slight unevenness of it cradled the curve of your skull in a way that felt surprisingly natural. When you leaned back fully onto the hay, your full weight settling into the bed you had made, the sound was a slow, prolonged crunch, like footsteps on a gravel path, but softer and more diffuse, spread out across your entire back and shoulders and hips. The hay accepted you gradually, not all at once. It took a moment for the stalks to shift and resettle under this new pressure, and you could feel the changes happening beneath you, a series of tiny adjustments that traveled through the pile like a wave. Your shoulder blades pressed down first, creating two distinct hollows, and then the small of your back sank deeper, and finally your hips found their place, making a broader depression that the surrounding hay rose up to meet. The hay shaped itself to you, not perfectly, but with a kind of patient accommodation, filling the spaces under your knees and elbows, supporting the curve of your spine in a dozen small places. It was an uneven surface, no doubt, full of small lumps and hollows that you would not have tolerated in a real bed. But now, with your muscles so tired, even the imperfections felt like a kind of attention, as if the hay were trying its best to hold you. As you settled, a faint cloud of dust rose from the disturbed hay, particles so fine that they hung in the air for a long moment before drifting down again. You could not see the dust, but you could feel it as a slight tickling in your nostrils, and at the back of your throat, a dryness that made you swallow once, twice, until it passed. The dust was nothing more than the remains of flowers and seed heads that had crumbled during the drying months, the pollen and fine chaff that had been trapped between the stalks and was now released by your movements. It settled on your skin and your uniform as a nearly imperceptible film, soft as talcum, and you accepted it as part of the hay's character, a reminder that this bedding had a history of sun and wind and rain long before it had ever entered this barn. The smell of the hay was complex and layered, and as you lay still you began to notice its different notes, the way a person might notice the ingredients in a familiar dish only after letting it rest on the tongue. The most immediate scent was the dry, papery smell of the stalks themselves, a smell like old books or dried leaves, slightly dusty and neutral. Beneath that, there was a sweetness that came from the clover and vetch that had been mixed in with the grass when it was cut, their dried blossoms still carrying a ghost of honey and vanilla. You could detect the distinct greenish aroma of timothy grass, even in its dried state, a smell that reminded you of hayfields in late June, the long stems bending under the scythe, the air thick with the scent of crushed vegetation. And running through all of it, like a thin thread, was a hint of something musty, a touch of mildew that had formed when the hay was stacked slightly too damp after an autumn rain. A faint earthiness that was not unpleasant but rather grounding, anchoring the sweetness in something older and deeper. Together these smells blended into a single fragrance that was warm and enclosing, wrapping around you like a blanket of scent, familiar and comforting in a way that you could not fully explain. You shifted your position slightly, turning onto your side and drawing your knees up just a little, and the hay shifted with you, rustling and resettling to accommodate this new arrangement. It made a sound like a long, slow exhale, a shushing noise that seemed to hush the barn itself. The stalks that were now directly under your hip had been crushed flatter, while the ones near your stomach had been pushed into a low ridge, and you could feel the warmth of your own body beginning to reflect back at you, the hay acting as an insulator that trapped the heat you were giving off. The longer you lay there, the warmer your nest became, the chill of the night air retreating from your skin, replaced by a cozy, enclosed warmth that made your eyelids feel heavy. The hay that touched your face was slightly scratchy, the tips of the stalks poking gently at your cheek and temple, but it was a minor discomfort, easily ignored, and it actually served to keep you just alert enough to appreciate the comfort, a small edge that made the softness seem softer by contrast. You remembered that you had your greatcoat, and you decided to spread it beneath you to soften some of the prickles. You sat up just enough to pull the heavy wool coat from under your shoulders, and the hay protested with a series of sharp crackles, as if reluctant to let you go. You unfolded the coat and spread it as smoothly as you could over the hay, the dark blue wool looking almost black in the darkness, the brass buttons cool to the touch. When you lay back down, the difference was immediate. The wool added a layer of soft, yielding fabric that smoothed over the roughest stalks, while still allowing the hay's springy support to come through. The combination was unexpectedly pleasant, the wool providing a gentle, almost velvety surface, and the hay beneath it offering a firm but forgiving foundation. The two materials worked together in a way that neither could have achieved alone, and he felt a small surge of gratitude for this simple improvement, a minor luxury that made the barn feel even more like a place of real rest. You let your hand rest on the hay beside you, palm down, and you could feel the individual stalks through the thin skin between your thumb and forefinger, a delicate braille of ridges and nodes. Some of the stalks still had their seed heads attached, tiny clusters that were hard and round, like miniature beads, and you could roll them between your fingers until they broke apart into chaff. There were other things in the hay too, the occasional dried leaf from a tree that had overhung the field, a stray piece of straw from the thatched roof that had fallen down, even a small dried flower that still held a trace of its blue color, though you could only feel its shape, not see its hue. The hay was not uniform, it was a collection of fragments, a living record of the meadow from which it had been cut, and exploring it with your fingers was a slow, meditative occupation that kept your mind gently occupied without rousing it. You thought briefly of the field where this hay had grown, a field you had never seen but could easily imagine. A wide, flat stretch of land bordered by low stone walls, the grasses rippling in a summer breeze, the clover blooming in pink and white patches, the timothy grass standing tall with its dense cylindrical heads. You pictured the farmers moving through it with their scythes, the long blades flashing in the sun, the sound of the cutting, a rhythmic swishing that went on for hours under a hot sky. The cut grass had been left to dry in the sun for several days, turned once with wooden forks to ensure even curing, and then gathered into wagons and brought here to this barn, where it was stacked high in the loft and allowed to settle into the quiet darkness. That hay had been destined for animals, to feed cows or horses through the winter, but tonight it was feeding something else. Your need for rest, your body's craving for a soft place to lie, and in that sense it was fulfilling a purpose just as important. The thought was a peaceful one, and it drifted through your mind without leaving a mark, like a cloud crossing a still sky. The darkness of the barn made it impossible to see the hay's color, but you could feel its warmth, its texture, its smell, and those sensations were more than enough to build a complete picture. You could feel that the hay was clean, not dirty or soiled, because the farmers had been careful when they stored it, and the barn floor was dry. The hay had a crispness that spoke of good drying weather, a texture that crinkled but did not mat or mold. You could feel that it was abundant, that there was more than enough for all the men in the barn, and that even if you took more to make your bed thicker, there would still be plenty left. This sense of plenty was itself a comfort, a subconscious assurance that you were not taking anything from anyone, that the barn's generosity was large enough for all. From somewhere in the loft above, a tiny trickle of chaff sifted down through the cracks between the floorboards, landing on your sleeve with a sound so faint it was barely a whisper. You brushed it away absently, and the chaff scattered into the air, joining the general dust that hung suspended, waiting to settle. The barn was so still that even this small action felt significant, a ripple in the deep pond of the night. You listened for other sounds, and you heard the same tiny cascade happening elsewhere, perhaps where another soldier had shifted, or where the building itself had settled. The hay was constantly, almost imperceptibly, in motion, responding to the collective breathing of the men, to the slow creep of temperature changes, to the weight of time itself. It was a living material, in a sense, continuing to dry and cure and change, even as you lay upon it. Your body was now thoroughly warm, the hay having trapped a pocket of heat around you, and you felt the last of the day's chill leave your bones. Your feet, still in their boots but no longer bearing weight, were comfortable, and your hands, which had been cold when you first entered the barn, were now tucked into the hay beside you, feeling the pleasant friction of the stalks against your palms. You wiggled your toes inside the leather, a small, private movement, and the hay responded with a distant crackle, as if acknowledging the gesture. The greatcoat beneath you had stopped any stray stalks from poking through, and the wool had absorbed a bit of your own scent, blending with the smell of the hay to create something uniquely yours, a temporary signature of your presence that would fade by morning. You closed your eyes again, and the darkness behind your lids was the same as the darkness of the barn, but now it was filled with the sensory memory of the hay, the crackle and the scent, and the gentle give. You could feel the hay as a constant, steady presence, not demanding attention, but simply there, doing its quiet work. It was nothing like a proper bed, as you had thought before, and yet it was exactly what you needed. After a full day on your feet, after miles of hard road and the weight of your equipment, this humble bed of dried grass was a generous gift, offered without condition. The hay asked nothing of you, it simply held you, and that holding was enough to begin the slow, gentle slide towards sleep. Lying still in the hay, with the sounds of the barn settling around you like a blanket being drawn up to your chin, you became aware of your uniform in a way you had not been for many hours. While you were marching, the uniform was simply a necessity, a collection of layers and straps that kept you decent and carried your equipment. You did not think about it any more than a bird thinks about its feathers. But now, with your body at rest and your mind slowing, the details of what you wore began to surface one by one, each piece telling its own small story of the day and all the days before. You were still fully dressed as a Prussian infantryman, and lying down in uniform was a familiar art, one you had learned through many nights like this one, in many barns and bivouacs and temporary shelters scattered across the countryside. The uniform was not uncomfortable once you knew how to wear it for sleep, and you had made the necessary adjustments without even thinking, your hands moving through the routine while your mind was elsewhere. Your dark blue wool coat was the largest and most noticeable piece, the garment that defined your silhouette and marked you as a soldier even from a distance. This coat had once been a deep, vibrant blue, the color of a midnight sky in high summer, but now it was faded in uneven patches, lighter across the shoulders where the sun had beaten down day after day, and darker in the creases of the elbows and under the arms where the original dye still clung stubbornly. The wool itself was thick and densely woven, meant to keep out the wind and the cold, and it had done its job faithfully through months of service, but the fabric had grown stiff with road dust that had worked its way deep into the fibers, a fine grey powder that no amount of brushing could fully remove. When you moved, the coat made a soft, rasping sound, the sound of wool against wool, of dust trapped in the weave, of a garment that had become more like a shell than a piece of clothing. You had unbuttoned it from the collar down to the middle of your chest, not all the way, just enough to ease the pressure against your throat and allow your breathing to deepen without constraint. The buttons were brass, small and round, each one sewn on with thick thread that had been replaced more than once, and they were cool to the touch now, having lost the warmth of your body to the barn's still air. Beneath the coat, you wore a waistcoat of lighter wool, a greyish buff colour that was barely visible even in daylight, and a linen shirt that was coarse against your skin, its collar folded open, the fabric softened by countless washings in cold streams and the sweat of long marches. The shirt had a faint smell of your own body, not unpleasant, just familiar, a smell of salt and wool and the particular scent of a man who'd been walking under the sun and sleeping in the open. You could feel the waistcoat's buttons pressing gently against your chest when you inhaled, a row of small, hard points that reminded you of the layers between you and the hay. It was all part of the uniform's architecture, and you were grateful for it now because these layers trapped warmth and kept the cool drafts from reaching your skin. Across your shoulders and chest, the white leather crossbelts still lay in their accustomed positions, though you had loosened them slightly when you first sat down. One belt ran diagonally from your left shoulder to your right hip, supporting the cartridge box that you had set aside on the hay near your pack, its weight now gone, but its memory still imprinted in the leather. The other belt crossed the first at the center of your chest, holding the bayonet scabbard, which you had also removed and laid within arm's reach, the brass hilt catching the faintest hint of light from the gap in the doors. The belts were made of thick, durable cowhide that had been whitened with pipe clay, though the white was now scuffed and grey in places, worn down to the natural tan underneath where the clay had rubbed off against your coat or your equipment. The leather was stiff, especially near the buckles, where years of tension had compressed the fibers into hard ridges that never fully relaxed, and they creaked softly whenever you shifted, a sound as familiar as your own heartbeat. Even loosened, the belt still pressed against your shoulders and chest with a gentle, constant weight, a pressure that had been with you for so long that you no longer noticed it as a separate sensation. It had become part of you, a background note in the symphony of your body's awareness. Your white linen gaiters covered your lower legs from just below the knee to the ankle, where they met the tops of your shoes. The gaiters were meant to protect your legs from mud and stones and the underbrush that tore at your stockings on the march, and they had done their duty well, but they were now smudged with soil, marked by the dark brown of the road and the grey dust of the meadow. The linen was sturdy but not stiff, softened by use and by the dampness of the evening dew that had wicked up from the grass as you walked across the field to the barn. Each gaiter was fastened by a row of small buttons that ran up the outside of your leg, and you reached down with one hand, your movement slow and heavy with fatigue, to check them. Your fingers found the buttons one by one, feeling the slight dome of each against the fabric, the thread that held them tight, the little loop of the buttonhole that had not stretched or torn. They were all secure, none had come undone, and this small verification satisfied a deep, almost unconscious need for order, the soldier's instinct to ensure that everything was in its place before surrendering to rest. You let your hand fall back onto the hay, the task complete, and the gaiters continued to wrap your legs in their quiet, practical embrace. The stiff collar of your coat, which could be a source of constant irritation on the long day, no longer chafed your neck because you had solved that problem days ago with a simple piece of ingenuity. You'd taken a strip of soft cloth, torn from an old shirt that had been beyond repair, and folded it carefully into a narrow band, then tucked it inside the collar where the rough wool edge met your skin. The cloth was a buffer, a soft barrier that absorbed the friction and kept the collar from rubbing you raw, and it had worked so well that you had almost forgotten it was there. Now, as you lay with your head on your makeshift hay pillow, you could feel the cloth against the back of your neck, a slightly fuzzy texture that was warmer and gentler than the coat itself, and you adjusted it with a subtle tilt of your chin, seating it more comfortably in the groove between your collar and your skin. It was a small thing, this strip of cloth, but it made a great difference, transforming the coat from a piece of military discipline into something that could be worn even in sleep. Your tricorn hat, that distinctive three-cornered shape that marked you as a soldier of the Prussian line, was no longer on your head. You had removed it when you first entered the barn, and it now rested on top of your pack a few feet away, where you could keep it in your peripheral awareness even in the darkness. The hat was made of black felt, stiffened with glue to hold its shape, and the edges were soft and curling from exposure to rain and sweat, and the constant handling of being put on and taken off. The brim was no longer crisp. It had a wavy, organic quality, dipping slightly in the front where you habitually grasped it, and rising at the back where it had been bent against your pack during a previous night's rest. The cockade, a small rosette of black and white ribbon, was still pinned to the side, though the colours had faded to a uniform grey, and the metal button that held it was slightly tarnished. You could picture the hat clearly in your mind, its familiar shape a comfort in the dark, and knowing it was there, safe and within reach, was another small anchor for your thoughts. Each piece of the uniform, from the coat to the gaiters to the belts, carried with it the history of the march, a record written not in words, but in wear patterns, in the particular distribution of dust and fraying, in the shape the garments had taken from your body's repeated motions. The right shoulder of your coat was slightly more faded than the left, because you always carried your musket on that side, the stock resting against the wool, the friction of wood on fabric polishing the nap over time. The knees of your breeches, hidden beneath the gaiters, were thin and shiny from kneeling to drink at streams or to check the straps of your pack, and the seat had a patch of darker fabric where a tear had been mended with careful stitches. Your shoes, black leather with brass buckles, were scuffed at the toes from stones on the road, and the soles were worn smooth in the middle, the heels slightly rounded from the constant impact of your stride. Even your stockings, woolen and grey, had a darn spot on the left heel where a blister had formed weeks ago, the repair done by firelight with a needle from your sewing kit, the stitches uneven but strong. The smells of the uniform were as layered as the smells of the hay, a complex blend that told the story of your day and your duty. There was the smell of your own sweat, a salty, slightly sour note that was strongest under the arms and across the back, where the coat had been pressed against your skin for hours. There was the smell of wool, that clean animal scent that wool always carries, even when it is old and worn, a smell like sheep on a hillside, warm and slightly oily. There was the smell of leather from the belts and the shoes, a rich tannic aroma that mingled with the fainter scent of the brass polish you had used days ago, a metallic tang that still clung to your fingers if you brought them close to your face. And running through all of it like a constant baseline was the smell of the road itself, a mixture of dry earth and crushed grass and the mineral dust that had been kicked up by hundreds of marching feet, a smell so pervasive that you would stop noticing it until you were away from the column, here in the barn, where the sweet hay scent began to replace it. Together, these smells were not unpleasant. They were the scent of a soldier, the honest odor of a man who had worked hard and lived simply, and they were as much a part of your identity as your name. Lying still, you began to feel the uniform less as a set of military requirements and more as a familiar second skin, something that was so integrated with your sense of self that you could not imagine being without it. The coat was not just a coat. It was a shelter, a constant presence that had kept you warm on cold nights and shielded you from the sun on hot days, that had been a pillow when you rolled it up and a blanket when you spread it out. The crossbelts, even in their current loosened state, were a reminder of your role, A gentle pressure that said you were a soldier, yes, but not in a demanding way, just in a quiet, factual way, like the beat of your heart or the sound of your own breathing. The gaiters, hugging your legs, were a support that kept your muscles from swelling, a compression that felt almost therapeutic now that you were at rest. And the strip of cloth in your collar was a personal touch, a small defiance of the regulation stiffness, a sign that you had learned to make the uniform your own. You shifted your shoulders slightly, settling deeper into the hay, and the belts creaked once in response, a sound so familiar that you barely registered it. The coat's wool pulled gently across your back as you moved, the fabric stretching in places where it had molded to your shape, and then it relaxed again as you became still. The brass buttons on your waistcoat glinted faintly in your mind's eye, even though you could not see them, and you felt the cool metal of a buckle near your hip where the crossbelt ended, the metal having absorbed the barn's cool air. All of these sensations were muted and distant, perceived through the softening lens of approaching sleep, and they blended into a single cohesive feeling of being held, not just by the hay, but by the uniform itself. It was a second skin as you had thought, and like your own skin you did not have to think about it. It simply was, a constant and reassuring presence that anchored you to the present moment, preventing your thoughts from drifting too far into the past or the future. The uniform was the boundary between you and the world, and tonight that boundary was relaxed and gentle, a soft shell that protected you while you rested. Inside the barn, sound did not end when the movement stopped. It simply changed its nature, becoming softer and more diffuse, spreading out into the darkness like water soaking into dry earth. The loudest thing in the whole space, now that boots had stilled and packs had been set down, was the breathing of the men around you, each sleeper contributing his own rhythm to a collective chorus that filled the air with a gentle, constant motion. Near your left side, a soldier lay on his back with his mouth slightly open, and his breath came in long, slow waves, a deep inhale that lifted his chest against the straps of his equipment, followed by a longer exhale that fluttered the loose strands of hay near his lips, making them tremble and dance in the dark. You could not see. The sound was a soft, low whoosh, like air moving through a distant bellows, and it had a steady, predictable quality that was deeply soothing, a metronome marking the passage of the night. Further along the row of resting men, another soldier breathed in a different pattern, a little faster and shallower, as if he was still caught in the effort of the march, his body not yet fully surrendered. But even his breathing was quiet, just a series of small sips and sighs that blended with the deeper notes to create a layered, harmonious hum. You let your own breathing slow to match the drowsy tempo around you, and you noticed that the sound of your own breath, so close to your ears, was different from the others, a more intimate whisper that seemed to come from inside your head as much as from your chest. When you inhaled, the air passed through your nostrils with a faint, high-pitched whistle, a sound so subtle that only you could hear it, and when you exhaled, the air left your lips in a silent stream that stirred the hay directly beneath your chin. The combined breathing of all the men produced a slight rise and fall in the barn's atmosphere, a barely perceptible tide of air that moved back and forth between the walls, carrying the scent of hay and wool and tired bodies, and the sound of this collective respiration was like the barn itself was alive, a great sleeping creature whose lungs were made of 40 tired soldiers. Beneath the layer of breathing there were other sounds, smaller and more sporadic, that punctuated the quiet without disturbing it. Someone, perhaps 3 or 4 men away, turned over in his sleep, and the hay beneath him responded with a sharp, prolonged crackle, the sound of 1,000 dry stalks being crushed all at once. It started as a sudden spike of noise, a brief rustling explosion that made you open your eyes in the darkness, and then it faded quickly, the stalks settling into their new positions with a series of softer, diminishing clicks, like the last pops of a dying fire. The man let out a long, low sigh as he resettled, a sound of deep satisfaction, or perhaps just the unconscious release of air from his lungs, and then the silence flowed back in, thicker than before, as if the barn had held its breath for a moment and now let it out again. Not long after, another soldier shifted his weight from one hip to the other, and his greatcoat made a dry, whisking sound against the hay, the wool rasping over the straw in a quick, repeated motion that ended with a soft thump as his arm fell loosely onto the pile beside him. You could almost picture the movement in your mind's eye, the slow, uncoordinated gesture of a man already deep in dreams. The timber frame of the barn had its own voice, a slow and ancient voice that spoke only occasionally, when the temperature changed or the wind pressed against the walls. High above you, somewhere in the darkness of the roof, a beam creaked, a long, low groan that stretched out for several seconds and then stopped abruptly, as if the wood had been asked a question and had given its answer. The sound was deep and resonant, traveling through the entire structure so that you felt it as much as heard it, a faint vibration in the packed earth beneath your back. It was not a sharp or alarming creak, but a gentle one, the kind of sound that old buildings make when they settle into the night, adjusting their joints after a day of holding up the roof and keeping out the weather. Another beam answered a few minutes later, this one closer to the doors, and its voice was slightly higher in pitch, a soft, musical note that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before dissolving. These creaks were like the barn's own breathing, slow and irregular, a reminder that the shelter around you was not a dead thing, but a structure with its own history and its own way of responding to the world. The wind outside was a constant presence, though it never rose to the level of a storm or even a strong gust. It was just a steady, persistent breeze that moved across the meadow and brushed against the barn's wooden walls with a patient, endless touch. You could hear it as a continuous hush, a sound like someone shushing a child to sleep, a soft, shushing whisper that ran along the planks and found its way through every tiny gap and crack. When the wind pressed a little harder, the hush deepened into a low, hollow moan, a sound that seemed to come from the very corners of the barn where the walls met the roof and the air was trapped in eddies. Then the gust would pass, and the sound would ease back to its gentle bass line, a whisper so quiet that you had to listen carefully to be sure it was still there. The wind also made the loose doors shift slightly in their frame, and the iron hinges gave a soft, rhythmic squeak, a tiny sound that repeated in an irregular pattern, never quite predictable, each squeak a little different in pitch and length, as if the door were having a slow, sleepy conversation with itself. Beyond the barn, out in the darkness of the meadow and the fields beyond, other sounds rose and fell, carried on the same wind that touched the walls. Far away, a dog barked, a single sharp note that cut through the night and then was gone, swallowed by the distance and the stillness. You waited, half expecting a second bark or an answering call from another farm, but none came. The dog had spoken its piece and returned to its own slumber, leaving the silence even deeper than before. The bark had been so distant that it was almost not a sound at all, just a brief interruption of the quiet, like a pebble dropped into a pond, the ripples spreading out and fading almost before you noticed them. A little later, a night bird called from somewhere across the meadow, a single plaintive note that rose in pitch and then fell away, a sound that was both lonely and peaceful, a reminder that the world outside the barn was still alive, still turning through its nocturnal rhythms. The bird called only once, and you imagined it perched on a fence post or a low branch, its dark eyes watching the same darkness that you lay within, and then it tucked its head under its wing and was silent. Closer to the barn, much closer, perhaps just outside the wall near your head, something small moved in the grass, a mouse or a vole making its way through the stems with a faint, scratching rustle. The sound was so delicate that you might have missed it if you were not already so still, a series of tiny, rapid scratches that came and went in bursts as the little creature paused to sniff the air and then continued on its way. The scratching stopped at the base of the wall, and you heard a soft, almost inaudible squeak, a sound so high and thin that it was like a needle of noise piercing the darkness, there and gone in an instant. Then the scratching moved away again, growing fainter, until it was lost in the general hush of the wind, and the mouse's presence became just a memory, a small secret shared between you and the night. Inside the barn, high up in the rafters that you could not see, there was another sound, a periodic, delicate scratching that came from the loft of the roof beams themselves. You could hear it as a faint, rhythmic scrabbling, a sound like tiny claws on old wood, and you guessed that a bird, or perhaps a bat, had found its way into the barn and was moving about in the darkness above. The scratching would last for a few seconds, a quick, fluttering series of taps and scrapes, and then it would stop, leaving a silence so complete that you could hear your own heartbeat if you listened for it. Then, after a long pause, the scratching would start again, a little to the left or the right of its previous location, as the creature shifted its perch or explored a new beam. The sound was not alarming. It was just another part of the barn's nighttime chorus, a small, wild note that belonged to a world that was separate from the world of men, and it made you feel, in a strange way, even more sheltered, because you were inside, and it was inside too, both of you seeking refuge from the cold and the dark. Sometimes, when the wind fell completely still and no one moved and no creature scratched, there was a moment of absolute silence that seemed to press on your ears like a soft weight, a silence so deep that you could hear the blood moving through your own body, a distant oceanic roar that was always there, but usually hidden beneath the surface of sound. In those moments the barn felt like a bubble suspended outside of time, a pocket of perfect stillness that the world had forgotten. But the silence never lasted long. Soon a soldier would sigh, or a beam would creak, or the wind would return with its gentle shushing, and a tapestry of sound would weave itself back together, thread by thread, until the barn was once again filled with its quiet, living music. All these sounds blended into a single, continuous backdrop, a lullaby that had no beginning and no end, no melody and no words, just a steady stream of small, unremarkable noises that together created a profound sense of peace. None of the sounds were loud enough to startle you. None were so strange as to cause alarm. They were the sounds of a world at rest, the ordinary music of a rural night in a quiet corner of Prussia, and they told you, without words, that you were safe, surrounded, and not alone. The breathing of your comrades was a reassurance that your company was intact, that every man had made it to shelter and was now recovering from the day's exertions. The creaking of the barn was a reminder that the shelter itself was strong, old and weathered, but still standing, still holding firm against the wind and the cold. The distant bark of the dog and the call of the bird were signs that life continued beyond the barn's walls, that the fields and farms were still there, that morning would come and the world would go on as it always had. And the tiny, close sounds of the mouse and the bird in the rafters were a reminder that you were not the only creature seeking warmth and rest, that the barn was a refuge for all kinds of life, all of it drawn to the same dry hay and the same still air. As you listened, you did not try to separate the sounds or identify them or hold on to them. You simply let them wash over you, a gentle tide that rose and fell without your intervention. Your breathing synchronized with the slow rhythm of the barn, each inhale drawing in the dusty sweetness, each exhale releasing a little more of the day's tension. The sounds became a kind of blanket, wrapping around you just as the darkness and the hay and the wool of your uniform did, adding another layer to the cocoon that was forming around your body and mind. You felt your thoughts becoming as diffuse as the sounds themselves, losing their sharp edges and their connections to one another, drifting apart like the notes of a distant melody that fades into silence. The barking dog, the creaking beam, the scratching mouse, they all merged into a single, soft hum, a hum that was the sound of the night itself, and you let yourself sink into it, deeper and deeper, until the boundary between listening and sleeping grew so thin that it disappeared altogether. The darkness inside the barn, when you first opened your eyes after a long moment of resting them, seemed absolute, a complete absence of light that pressed against your pupils and offered nothing in return. You had been lying still with your eyes closed, listening to the sounds of the barn and the breathing of the men, and the darkness behind your eyelids had been a personal darkness, a warm, reddish-black void that belonged only to you. But when you lifted your lids, the darkness of the barn itself was different. It was a shared darkness, vast and cool, filling every corner and every space between the rafters, a darkness so deep that it felt like a substance, like water or heavy cloth, something you could almost touch if you reached out your hand. For a long while there was nothing to see at all, No shapes or shadows, just a uniform blackness that seemed to stretch on forever in every direction, up and down and side to side, without any reference point to anchor your gaze. This was not frightening. It was simply the way the barn was at this hour, a sealed box of night that had been closed against the world. But as you continued to look, not staring hard but just letting your eyes rest open, the darkness began to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way a fog lifts so gradually that you cannot point to the moment it disappears. The change started at the edges of your vision, where the blackness seemed to thin just slightly, and then it crept inward, and you began to perceive gradations of shadow, degrees of darkness that you had not noticed before. The barn was not a uniform void after all. It was a landscape of deep greys and blacks, a charcoal drawing in which the darkest areas marked the solid objects and the slightly lighter areas marked the empty spaces. You realized that some small amount of light must be entering the barn from outside, not enough to illuminate anything clearly, but just enough to create a faint, ghostly distinction between mass and air, between what was there and what was not. The source of this light was the narrow gap where the great doors did not quite meet, and the even narrower cracks between the wall planks, and perhaps the small ventilation opening high up near the roof peak, all of them admitting the faintest grey hint of starlight or the very first suggestion of the dawn that was still hours away. You let your gaze drift toward the doors, and there, where the two heavy wooden panels came together, you could just trace a vertical line of slightly lighter dark, a seam of not quite black that ran from the floor up to the height of a man's head, and then was lost in the deeper shadow of the lintel. The line was so thin and so faint that if you looked directly at it, it seemed to disappear. But if you let your eyes soften and look just to the side of it, it returned, a ghost of light that shimmered and wavered with the slightest movement of your head. Through that gap you knew was the meadow and the cold night air and the stars that were hidden behind the clouds, and the knowledge that the outside world was still there, just beyond the few inches of wood, was both strange and comforting. The gap was a connection, a thread of silver that tied the barn's deep darkness to the greater darkness of the night, and it reminded you that you were not buried or entombed, but simply sheltered, wrapped in a protective shell that still remembered the sky. Your eyes, now growing accustomed to this near darkness, began to find other lines and edges, and the barn's interior slowly assembled itself out of the shadows like a picture developing on a plate, not in color, but in subtle shades of gray. The wall planks themselves, which you had felt with your hands when you first entered, now revealed themselves as faint vertical stripes, a series of alternating dark and slightly less dark bands, where the boards met and where they stood alone. The planks were not perfectly fitted. Some had warped over the years, and you could see the hairline cracks between them as even fainter threads of light, so subtle that you were not sure if you were really seeing them or if your mind was filling in what your fingers had already learned. The wall to your left was a flat expanse of deep charcoal, unbroken except for one place where a knot in the wood had fallen out long ago, leaving a small, round hole that glowed with a pinprick of grey, like a tiny, distant star that had come down from the sky to rest in the barn wall. You fixed your gaze on that pinprick for a while, and it seemed to pulse slightly, though that was only the movement of your own blood in your eye, and it was a small, steady companion in the dark. The pile of hay beside you, which you had been lying on and shaping and smelling, was not visible as a distinct object, but as a formless, darker mound that rose from the floor and spilled toward you in soft, rounded contours. The hay absorbed light rather than reflecting it, so it appeared as a deep, velvety black, almost a hole in the darkness, a shape defined by its absence of the faint grey that touched the walls. You could see where the top of the pile crested, a long, low ridge that ran parallel to your body, and you could see where it sloped down to meet the floor, the transition marked by a gradual blending of one darkness into another. The hay was not a solid block. It had dips and rises, small valleys where your arm had pressed, a gentle peak where you had mounded the pillow, and these variations created subtle shadows within the shadow, a landscape in miniature that your eyes traced slowly, lazily, without any need to interpret or name. Your pack, which you had set down near the wooden partition, was a squat square silhouette, a block of deeper darkness against the already dark wall. Its shape was geometric, a rectangle with slightly rounded corners, and it stood out from the organic forms of the hay and the sleeping men because of its regularity, its man-made edges that cut across the natural chaos of the barn. You could just make out the curve of the leather straps that you had loosened, hanging down like limp arms, and the faint metallic gleam of a buckle that caught the tiniest fragment of light and held it, a single dull spark that winked at you and then went still. Your tricorn hat rested on top of the pack, and its three-cornered outline was distinct, a dark triangle that seemed to float above the pack's bulk, its edges soft and blurred but still recognizable. You had seen that hat 1,000 times, and your mind supplied the details that your eyes could not. The black felt, the cockade, the little curve of the brim where your fingers always lifted it. Seeing it now, even as just a shape in the darkness, was like seeing an old friend, a familiar object that anchored you to your own identity. Around you, the other soldiers were not visible as people, but as long, low mounds of darkness, each one a slightly different size and shape, each one marked by the subtle rise and fall of breathing. The man nearest to you was a dark ridge just a few feet away, his body a long horizontal form under his greatcoat, his head a rounder, darker shape at one end. You could see where his arm lay outside the coat, a thin shadow extending from the larger mass, the hand a small curled darkness that rested on the hay. Further away the mounds became less distinct, blending into the general darkness until they were just part of the floor's uneven surface, and you could not tell where one sleeper ended and another began. The barn felt full but not crowded, each man wrapped in his own envelope of darkness, and the sight of them all lying so still, so deeply at rest, reinforced your own sense of peace, the knowledge that you were part of a collective surrender to the night. High above, the roof beams were entirely invisible, lost in a darkness so complete that it might as well have been the sky. You knew they were there because you had glimpsed them upon entering, great oak timbers that spanned the width of the barn, blackened by age and smoke, their surfaces rough with the marks of the adze that had shaped them a century ago. Even though you could not see them now, your mind supplied their presence, and you could almost feel them up there, massive and solid, holding up the roof from the hayloft and the weight of all the years. The space above you felt tall and open, a cathedral of darkness that soared upward, and the invisible beams gave it a sense of structure, a skeleton that held the barn together. You imagined the beams crossing each other in the dark, forming triangles and squares, the joints pegged with wooden dowels that had not loosened in 100 winters, and the image was a comfort, a reminder that the roof would not fall, that the barn had stood for a long time and would stand for a long time more. The ladder to the hayloft was somewhere to your right, leaning against the wall, and you could just perceive it as a diagonal slash of slightly lighter dark, the long straight pole with its horizontal rungs creating a pattern that was different from the vertical planks of the wall. The rungs were spaced evenly and they broke the wall's monotony, a series of small dark rectangles that marched upward and disappeared into the blackness of the loft. You remembered seeing the ladder when you first walked in, its wood warm smooth in the center of each rung from generations of farm hands climbing up and down, and you could picture the loft above, a floor of rough planks covered with more hay, perhaps some old tools left behind, a dusty stillness that no one had disturbed for months. The ladder was an invitation, a path to a higher, even more secluded space, but no one had taken it tonight, and it simply stood there, patient and unused, a vertical road to nowhere that added to the barn's sense of quiet order. The partition near which you had chosen to rest was a dark wall within the dark wall, a low wooden barrier that divided the barn into stalls, its planks running horizontally instead of vertically. You could see its top edge as a faint, straight line against the deeper darkness of the stall behind it, and you could see the posts that supported it, thick as shadows at regular intervals. The partition gave you a sense of enclosure, a smaller space within the larger space, and you liked the feeling of having a wall at your back, even a low one, because it meant that no one could approach you from that direction, that your sleep would be undisturbed. The partition surface was rough, you knew, because you had touched it earlier, and your fingers had found splinters and the smooth heads of old nails. but in the dark it was just a dark presence, a boundary that defined your small territory. As you lay and watched the darkness and the shapes within it, you noticed that your perception of the space was not static. It shifted and changed from moment to moment, the way a cloud changes shape when you stare at it. The faint light from the door gap seemed to flicker occasionally, though that was just the movement of the air or the settling of the building, and the shadows on the walls would deepen or lighten in response. The mounds of the sleeping men seemed to breathe along with the men themselves, rising and falling so slowly that the movement was almost imperceptible, a gentle collective tide that animated the darkness. The pinprick of light in the wall would sometimes disappear for a moment, as if something outside had passed in front of it, a bat or a night bird, and then it would reappear, steady and constant, a tiny beacon that marked the boundary between inside and outside. All of this movement was so subtle and so slow that it did not disturb you. It simply gave the darkness a living quality, a quiet animation that was deeply hypnotic. The dark was not threatening. It was enclosing, like a heavy curtain drawn around your small sleeping space, shutting out the world and all its demands. In this darkness there was no road to march, no officer to obey, no equipment to check, no future to worry about. There was only the present moment, the feel of the hay beneath you, the sound of the breathing around you, and the faint, shifting shapes that your eyes traced for no reason other than that they were there. The darkness simplified everything, reducing the world to a few basic elements: mass, space, texture, sound. It was a kind of sensory rest, a break from the constant visual input of the daylight world, and your mind, which had been processing the details of the march for so many hours, could finally let go and simply exist in this quiet, monochrome landscape. You let your eyes fall closed again, not because you were ready to sleep, but because you wanted to feel the darkness against your eyelids, the slight pressure of your own flesh creating a new layer of black. When you opened them a moment later, the barn's darkness seemed even more familiar, the shapes even more distinct, as if your brief closure had reset your vision and made it more sensitive. You could now see the outline of your own body as a dark form in the foreground, the curve of your chest and the rise of your bent knees, your hands lying on your stomach, fingers loosely curled. You were a shape among shapes, a shadow among shadows, and you belonged here in this quiet barn, in this deep and patient darkness that would hold you until the dawn. Now that you were truly still, the many small complaints of your body began to surface one by one, rising from the depths of your fatigue like bubbles in a dark pond, each one announcing its presence not as sharp pain, but as a dull, persistent signal that demanded acknowledgement. These aches had been with you all day, marching alongside you, step after step, but you had pushed them aside, tucked them away beneath the rhythm of the road and the requirements of duty. Now, with no more miles to cover and no more orders to hear, with the hay supporting your weight and the darkness wrapping you in stillness, your body finally had permission to speak, and it spoke in the language of tired muscles and compressed joints, a language you understood perfectly, a familiar catalogue of the day's effort made manifest in flesh and bone. Your feet were the first to make themselves known, pulsing inside your boots with a deep, resonant throb that seemed to beat in time with your heart. The soles of your feet, which had struck the hard-packed road thousands of times since midday, now radiated a warm, swollen tenderness that spread from the balls of your feet back to the heels, a sensation that was not exactly pain, but a kind of overwhelming awareness, as if every nerve ending had been awakened and was now slowly calming down. You could feel the individual pressure points, where the cobblestones and the ruts and the loose stones had pushed up through the thin leather of your soles, creating a detailed topographical map of the route you had walked, a map that your feet had memorized and were now replaying in the quiet. The arches, which had flexed and absorbed the shock of each step, held a deep, stretching ache, the kind that comes from being held in tension for too long, and you could feel the tendons on the top of your feet pulling gently, reminding you that they had been laced tight all day, that the boots had confined them in a rigid embrace. Your toes, curled slightly inside the dark leather, were stiff and cramped, and you slowly wiggled them one by one, feeling the joints crackle softly, the small bones shifting against each other after hours of being pressed together. The boots themselves had grown warm from your body heat, and the leather had softened with the moisture of sweat, molding to the unique shape of your feet, so that now they felt less like separate objects and more like a second layer of skin, a hard shell that protected even as it confined. The ache in your feet was the deepest and most insistent, but it was not alone. It was joined by a chorus of other sensations that traveled up your legs in a slow, rising wave. Your calves, which had powered each stride and absorbed the constant impact of the march, now held a tightness that was slowly beginning to loosen, the muscles feeling knotted and dense, like cords that had been twisted and were now gradually unwinding. You could sense the place where the calf muscle attached to the Achilles tendon, a small spot just above the heel that felt tender when you pressed it against the hay, and you became aware of the way the muscle fanned out and merged into the back of the knee, a complex architecture of tissue that had worked tirelessly without complaint. Your shins, too, had their own quiet voice, a faint, achy soreness along the front of the bone, the place where the impact of each footfall had traveled up through the skeleton, a vibration that had accumulated over the miles and now settled into a low humming resonance. You stretched your legs out fully, pointing your toes and then flexing them back, and the muscles responded with a series of small, fluttering releases, the fibers lengthening and softening as the tension drained away into the hay. The backs of your knees, which had been bent and straightened so many times, felt stiff and creaky, and you let them fall open slightly, the joints sighing with the relief of being allowed to rest in a neutral position, neither fully straight nor fully bent, just comfortably slack. Your thighs, hidden beneath the wool of your breeches, carried their own distinct memory of the march, a heavy, deep ache in the quadriceps, the large muscles at the front that had lifted your legs with each step and controlled your descent on the downhill slopes. These muscles now felt warm and slightly swollen, the blood still pooling in them as your body began its slow work of repair, and you could feel the individual bundles of fibers relaxing strand by strand, a process that was so gradual it was like watching a field of wheat slowly straighten after a wind has passed. The hamstrings at the back of your thighs were tighter, holding a pull that reached up into your hips, and you became aware of the long cord-like tendons that ran from behind your knees to the base of your pelvis, tendons that had been stretched and contracted in an endless rhythm, now finally allowed to go slack. You shifted your hips slightly, tilting your pelvis to ease the tension in your lower back, and the movement sent a ripple of sensation through your entire lower body, a chain reaction of muscles releasing in sequence, each one signaling to the next that it was all right to let go. Your lower back was the center of a great deal of attention now, a focal point of the body's complaint, where the weight of your pack had pressed down hour after hour, compressing the vertebrae and straining the thick bands of muscle that ran along either side of your spine. The pack had rested just above your hips, its canvas straps digging into your shoulders and transferring the load to the small of your back, and the result was a hollow, tired sensation, a feeling of emptiness and fullness at the same time, as if the muscles had been stretched too far and were now slowly contracting back to their natural length. You could trace the ache with your inner awareness, the dull, diffuse soreness that started just above your belt and radiated outward, wrapping around your sides and reaching up toward your ribs. When you breathed deeply, you could feel the muscles of your lower back moving, expanding slightly with the inhalation and relaxing with the exhalation, and you focused on this rhythm, using your breath to gently massage the area from the inside. The hay beneath your back, shaped now to the curve of your spine, provided a firm but forgiving support, filling the hollow of your lumbar region and allowing the muscles to unknot strand by strand, the tension melting into the straw like snow into warm ground. Above your lower back, in the broad expanse of your upper back and shoulders, another set of memories had been stored, these ones shaped by the weight of your musket and the pull of the cross belts. Your shoulders, where the leather straps had pressed down for so many hours, felt bruised in a subtle way, not with the sharp pain of a fresh injury, but with a deep, persistent tenderness, as if the bones and muscles had been compressed and were now slowly springing back. The trapezius muscles, which ran from your neck down to your shoulder blades, were tight and knotted, holding the tension of a day spent carrying a load, and you could feel the individual trigger points, small hard lumps that were sensitive to the touch, even the light touch of your own awareness. Your shoulder blades, those flat triangular bones that anchored so many muscles, seemed to ache dully where they pressed against the hay, and you moved them in a slow circular motion, rotating your shoulders back and down, feeling the joints crackle softly, the sound a quiet confirmation that things were settling into place. The collarbones where the cross belts had crossed and rubbed had a faint chafed sensation, the skin slightly irritated but not raw, and the cool air of the barn felt soothing on that spot, a gentle balm that eased the warmth. Your arms, which had swung at your sides for mile after mile, now lay heavy and inert on the hay beside you, or on your stomach, and they too had their own quiet language of fatigue. The forearms felt tight from gripping the musket, the flexor muscles that closed your fingers having been engaged all day, even when you were not actively holding the weapon. You uncurled your fingers slowly, stretching the tendons, and the sensation was one of release, a letting go that traveled up through your wrists and into the palms of your hands. Your wrists themselves, which had been bent at slight angles to hold the musket's stock, now felt stiff, and you rotated them gently, feeling the small bones slide over one another with a faint, gritty sensation, a reminder of the fine movements you had made all day without thinking. Your hands, when you brought them together on your chest, were cool and slightly swollen, the knuckles a bit puffy from the repetitive motion of gripping and releasing, and you interlaced your fingers and squeezed gently, feeling the joints compress and then release. A comforting, rhythmic pressure that seemed to push the ache out and let the warmth in. Even your jaw, which you had been clenching without thought throughout the long afternoon, now joined the chorus, a tightness in the muscles of your temples and along the sides of your face that you only noticed when you deliberately relaxed it. You let your jaw go slack, parting your lips just slightly, and the muscles of the hinge of your jaw unknotted with a tiny, almost inaudible pop, a release that spread up into your temples, easing a headache you had not even realized was there. The tension in your face, which had been held in a mask of concentration and endurance, now smoothed away, the furrows between your brows softening, the skin around your eyes loosening, your entire expression shifting from one of duty to one of deep, abiding rest. The back of your neck, where the stiff collar had pressed and where the weight of your head had been balanced all day, now felt tired in a heavy, pleasant way, the muscles that held your skull upright finally allowed to rest, your head sinking deeper into the hay pillow, the full weight of it surrendered to the straw's support. All these aches were not separate things, they were connected, a single, unified map of the march written across your entire frame, a record of every step and every hill and every pause, and as you lay there and let your attention drift from one to the next, you began to perceive them not as complaints, but as a quiet narrative of duty done. Each ache was a signal that you had worked, that you had moved across the earth under your own power, that you had carried your load without setting it down, and in that sense they were not something to be resented, but something to be acknowledged with a kind of quiet gratitude. Your body had served you well, it had carried you through the dust and the heat and the cold, and now, in this dark barn, it was simply asking for the chance to recover, to repair the small tears and replenish the spent energy, to prepare itself for whatever tomorrow might bring. You listened to your body's voice, and it was a low, steady hum, a hum of tired muscles and heavy bones, a hum that slowly, gradually began to soften as you breathed and let go. The process of letting go was not something you forced, it was something you allowed, a gentle permission that you gave to each part of your body in turn. You breathed in deeply, drawing the cool, hay-scented air down into your lungs, and as you exhaled, you imagined the tension leaving your feet, flowing out through the soles and into the earth, the ache dissolving like salt in water. Another breath, slow and even, and the tightness in your calves loosened a little more, the muscles softening, becoming heavier and more relaxed. Each exhale carried away a fraction of the day's burden, and each inhale brought a fresh wave of calm, a tide that rose and fell with a patient, oceanic rhythm. Your lower back, that hollow vessel of accumulated strain, seemed to expand and contract with your breathing, the vertebrae settling into a more natural alignment, the supporting muscles releasing their grip on one another, until they lay quiet and still. Your shoulders, which had been hunched without your knowledge, now dropped down and back, opening your chest, making more room for the air to enter, and the bruised feeling in the trapezius muscles faded to a warm, diffuse glow. Time, which had been so rigidly measured during the march, now became soft and elastic, stretching out around you as you lay and attended to your body. There was no hurry to fall asleep, no deadline for recovery. There was only this moment, this breath, this slow unwinding. You turned slightly onto your side, drawing one knee up toward your chest, and the new position shifted the distribution of pressure, allowing the parts of your back that had been bearing weight to rest and the parts that had been resting to bear weight. A gentle rotation of load that felt refreshing. The hay rustled and crackled around you, accommodating the change, and your body's aches murmured their approval, the map of the march being slowly erased and redrawn in softer lines. The feel of the wool greatcoat beneath you, the smell of the hay, the sound of your comrades' breathing, all of it merged into a single enveloping sensation, a cocoon of comfort that held you and your tired body in a state of deep, quiet peace, a peace that was built from the ground up, from the soles of your feet to the crown of your head, a peace that was the true reward of a day's hard labor. In the quiet of the barn, as your body softened and your breathing grew slow and even, fragments of the day's march began to drift through your mind like leaves on a slow stream. They did not come in order, and they did not come with any urgency. They were simply there, the last embers of the day's awareness flickering and receding, each one a small still image that rose to the surface of your thoughts, hung for a moment, and then dissolved back into the deeper darkness. The march itself had been a single continuous event, a ribbon of road and sky and effort that had stretched from the morning's assembly to the evening's halt. But now it was breaking apart, separating into its component pieces, and you were in no state to gather them back together. You let them come as they would, a gentle procession of memories that asked nothing of you except that you let them pass. The first image that surfaced was of a long, straight stretch of road lined with poplar trees, their leaves turning silver in the afternoon breeze. You had walked that road for what felt like an hour, perhaps more, the trees evenly spaced on either side like sentinels, their tall, narrow forms casting thin stripes of shade that fell across the road in a rhythmic pattern of light and dark. The poplars had been planted long ago, their trunks now thick and deeply furrowed, their bark a rough grey that caught the dust and held it in the crevices. When the wind moved through them, their leaves fluttered with a sound like distant water, a soft, rustling whisper that was different from the sound of the wind in other trees, higher and more delicate, and you would listen to that sound for mile after mile, letting it blend with the steady tramp of your boots until you no longer noticed it as a separate thing. You could still see, in your drowsy mind, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating a shifting mosaic on the road's surface, patches of gold that moved and changed shape as the branches swayed. The light had been warm on your shoulders, but the shade had been cool, and you remembered walking from one patch of shade to the next with a small, unspoken gratitude, a brief respite before the sun returned. Another stretch of road appeared now, this one without trees, open to the full breadth of the sky, and it had been hot and dusty, the kind of road that seemed to go on forever without a bend or a rise to break the monotony. The dust on that road had been a fine, pale powder, ankle-deep in places, and it had risen in small clouds with every step, coating your boots and the hem of your greatcoat, finding its way into the folds of your neckcloth, settling in your throat so that you tasted it with every breath. The dust had a dry, mineral taste, like old stone ground fine, and it had clung to your lips, making them feel dry and cracked, so that you had reached for your canteen more often than you might have otherwise, taking small sips of water that was never quite cool but still wet, still a relief. The dust had also muted the sound of the march, absorbing the sharp edges of the footfalls, so that the column moved in a kind of muffled quiet, a soft, shuffling progression that seemed almost dreamlike, as if you were all walking through a cloud of fine flour that blurred the boundaries between earth and air. You recalled, without trying to, a particular bend in the road where the column had slowed to pass through a narrow defile between two low hills, the earth rising on either side in gentle grassy slopes that blocked the wind and trapped the heat. In that narrow place, the air had been still and heavy, and the smell of the men around you had been more noticeable, a warm human smell of sweat and wool and leather, not unpleasant, but close, intimate, a reminder that you were part of a great breathing mass of soldiers, all moving in the same direction. The sound of the march had been different there too, the footfalls echoing slightly off the hillsides, creating a faint, hollow reverberation that made it sound as if there were many more men than there actually were, an endless column stretching back and forward, its beginning and end lost in the shimmer of heat. You had looked up at the grassy slopes and seen a single hawk circling high above, its wings motionless as it rode a thermal, a small dark shape against the pale blue of the sky, and you had watched it for a long moment, envying its stillness, its freedom from the road and the dust and the weight of your pack. The memory of a village surfaced now, a small cluster of stone houses with steep tiled roofs and narrow windows set around a central square where a stone fountain stood dry and unused. The village had been quiet when the column passed through, the only sign of life a few chickens scratching in the dirt and a thin dog that watched from a doorway without barking. An old woman had been standing at her gate, her hands folded on the top of the wooden bar, and she had simply watched the column pass, her expression unreadable but calm, her eyes moving slowly over the faces of the soldiers as if she were looking for someone she knew, or as if she were simply bearing witness to the passage of men through her world. She wore a dark dress and a white cap, and her face was deeply lined, the kind of lines that come from years of sun and wind, and she did not smile or frown or wave. She just stood there, still as a statue, her presence a quiet, human anchor in the flow of the march. You had looked at her as you passed, and for a moment your eyes had met, a brief, wordless connection that had lasted only a heartbeat before you were past her gate and the next house was sliding into view, but that image of her, the old woman at the gate, had stayed with you, a small, mysterious emblem of the day's journey. Now in the barn you saw her again, her dark dress and white cap, her calm, unblinking gaze, and the image was so clear that it might have been painted on the inside of your eyelids. You wondered, without any real curiosity, who she was, whether she was a grandmother or a widow, whether she had sons of her own who had gone off to be soldiers, whether she always stood at her gate when the army passed, or whether this was the first time. The questions were soft and distant, like the questions you might ask about a character in a story, and they did not demand answers, they simply floated there, mingling with the other fragments, and then they drifted away, replaced by something else. The something else was a halt by a stream, a small clear stream that had crossed the road at a shallow ford, its water flowing over smooth, round stones that glistened in the sunlight. The officer had called a brief rest, and the column had broken apart, men scattering to the banks to refill their canteens and splash water on their faces. You had knelt on the grassy edge, feeling the coolness of the stream rise up to meet you, and you had dipped your hands into the water, cupping them together to bring a drink to your lips. The water had been so cold that it made your teeth ache, a sharp, clean coldness that seemed to cut through the dust and the heat, and you had drunk deeply, feeling it travel down your throat and spread through your chest, a small liquid shock of refreshment. You had splashed water on your face as well, rubbing the back of your neck and your temples, and the droplets had run down into your collar, leaving cool trails on your skin that lingered for a long while after you stood up. The taste of that water, pure and slightly mineral, lingered in your memory now, and you could almost feel it again, the coldness on your tongue, the way it had washed away the dust and left your mouth feeling clean. At that same halt, you had sat on a low stone wall and taken a piece of bread from your haversack, a dense dark bread made from rye flour, its crust tough and chewy, its interior slightly sour from the leavening. The bread had been baked days ago, and it was no longer fresh, but it was still good, still sustaining, and you had eaten it slowly, breaking off small pieces and letting them soften in your mouth before you swallowed. The taste of the bread was familiar, a staple of your diet, and it brought with it a sense of home, of kitchens and ovens, and the simple act of breaking bread at a table. You had shared a few crumbs with a sparrow that had landed on the wall beside you, a bold little bird that cocked its head and looked at you with bright black eyes before darting in to snatch a morsel and fly away. The sparrow had returned twice, each time a little less wary, and you had felt a small, quiet pleasure in its company, a brief companionship that had made the halt feel less like a pause in a march and more like a moment of genuine rest. The rhythm of the march itself was a memory that now pulsed gently in your blood, a soft thrum that had not yet entirely faded. The steady tramp of boots on packed earth had been a constant backdrop to the entire day, a cadence that had started as a conscious effort, a deliberate matching of your steps to those of the men around you, and had gradually become automatic. A deep bodily rhythm that your legs and lungs and heart all followed without thought. The sound of so many boots hitting the ground at once, not perfectly synchronized but close enough, had a hypnotic quality, a repetitive, almost musical pattern that lulled the mind into a trance. You could still feel that rhythm now, not in your ears but in your chest, a faint residual pulse that was slowly being replaced by the slower rhythm of your breathing, the rhythm of rest, the rhythm of the barn settling into the night. There had been a long, gradual hill in the late afternoon, not steep but steady, that had tested your legs and your wind, and you recalled the way your breathing had deepened, your chest expanding more fully with each inhale, your heart beating a little faster to supply your muscles with blood. The men around you had leaned forward slightly into the slope, their packs shifting on their backs, their pace slowing almost imperceptibly, and a quiet had fallen over the column, a concentration of effort that made conversation impossible. You had focused on the heels of the man in front of you, watching the way his gaiters rose and fell, the way the dust puffed up from his boots, and you had counted your steps, a private, silent game that helped the time pass, counting up to 100 and then starting again. When you finally crested the hill, the road had leveled out, and a wide green valley had opened up before you, its fields stitched together with hedgerows, a distant church spire rising from a cluster of trees, and the sight had been like a small reward, a breath of beauty after the long, steady effort of the climb. These images and sensations drifted through your mind now in a slow, unhurried sequence, each one giving way to the next without any effort on your part. They were like the pages of a book being turned by a gentle wind, pausing here and there on a particular scene before moving on. The road, the trees, the village, the stream, the bread, the old woman, the hawk, the dust, they all wove together into a single tapestry of memory, a record of the day that was already beginning to fade, its colors softening, its edges blurring, as the present moment of the barn asserted its quiet dominance. You felt no need to hold on to any of them, no desire to fix them in place or examine them more closely. You were content to let them drift, to let them dissolve, to let the day become the past. The barn, the hay, the darkness, the breathing of your comrades, these were the realities now, and the march was a story you had already finished telling, a story that was now being gently closed and set aside, its pages settling into stillness as the long, slow night continued its patient work. Above your resting place, beyond the darkness that pressed against your eyes and the hay that cradled your tired body, the barn extended upward into a space you could not see but could feel in the way that a person feels the presence of a ceiling without looking. This upper region, the hayloft, was a second floor of rough planks supported by heavy beams that spanned the width of the barn, and you had glimpsed it briefly when you first stepped inside, a quick impression of a wooden platform looming over the main floor, its edges lined with a low railing, its surface piled with shapes that were probably more hay, perhaps some old tools, the accumulated storage of a working farm. The officer had not directed anyone up there, and no man had climbed the ladder. The loft remained undisturbed, a separate realm that existed in the darkness above, as quiet and still as the bottom of a deep pond. Now, lying on your back and staring up into the absolute blackness, you could not see the beams or the planks or the railing, but your mind supplied their image with a clarity that was almost visual, constructing the loft out of memory and imagination, a phantom architecture that seemed to float just beyond the reach of your vision. The beams were the first thing your mind reconstructed, those great oak timbers that you had noticed when you entered, their surfaces dark with age and rough with the marks of the adze that had shaped them long ago. They ran across the barn from wall to wall, massive, squared-off trunks of trees that had been growing for a century before they were cut, and they were set into the frame of the building with joints that had been pegged and wedged. No iron nails used in their original construction, just wood joining wood in a tight, enduring embrace. You had seen the ends of the beams where they rested on the wall plates, their cut faces showing the concentric rings of the tree's life, each ring a year of rain and sun and wind, all of them adding up to a thickness that spoke of immense strength. In the darkness now, you could almost trace those rings with your imagination, following the circles outward from the small dark heartwood to the lighter sapwood near the bark, a map of time that had been sealed inside the beam, holding up the barn through countless seasons. The beams were blackened by the smoke of old fires and by the slow accumulation of dust that had settled into every pore of the wood, and they had a dry, musty scent that mingled with the hay's sweetness, a smell like old books and ancient cellars, a smell that was the very essence of shelter. Across these beams, the floor of the hayloft had been laid, a series of rough-sawn planks that ran perpendicular to the beams, their edges not perfectly straight, their surfaces marked by the circular saw marks of the mill or the uneven strokes of a pit saw. The planks were of varying widths, some as broad as a man's hand, others narrower, and they had been nailed down with square-headed nails that you had seen glinting faintly in the lantern light, little dark points of iron that had rusted slightly over the years. The gaps between the planks were not tight. Time and the drying of the wood had opened small cracks, narrow slits that ran the length of each board, and through these cracks, occasionally, a tiny cascade of chaff and dust would sift down, a fine, almost invisible precipitation that drifted through the darkness and settled on the men and the hay below with a sound so faint it was barely more than a thought. You had felt this a few times already, a soft, dry tickling on your cheek or your sleeve, a single strand of hay or a grain of dust that had fallen from the loft above, and each time it had been a gentle reminder of the space overhead, a whisper from the upper darkness that said the loft was there, that it was real, that it was watching over you in its own silent way. What lay in the loft exactly you could only guess, but your guesses were informed by the brief glimpse you had caught and by a lifetime of knowing barns, of understanding what farmers stored in the high places. There would be more hay up there, certainly, older hay that had been cut in an earlier season, perhaps last year's crop that had never been fed out, its color faded from gold to a dull grayish-brown, its stems more brittle, its smell less sweet and more dusty. This older hay would be piled in loose mounds, shaped by the forks that had lifted it, and it would be thick with chaff, the fine powdery residue that accumulates when hay is handled and shifted, a dry, sneeze-inducing dust that hung in the air of the loft like a suspended cloud. The older hay might still have some of its seed heads attached, the dried blossoms of clover and vetch now crumbled to dust, and there might be the occasional dried stalk of corn mixed in, a remnant of a different harvest, its leaves rustling like paper when disturbed. The smell of this older hay would be fainter than the fresh hay below, a ghost of a scent, the memory of a summer that was even further in the past, and it would carry a slight mustiness, the faint earthy tang of vegetation slowly returning to soil. Besides the hay, there were probably other things stored in the loft, the kind of objects that accumulate in barns over the years, left behind when they are no longer needed, but too useful to throw away. You imagined a wooden rake with a broken tooth, propped against the railing, its handle worn smooth by the grip of many hands, the wood darkened by sweat and sun. There might be a coil of old rope, its fibers stiff and frayed, hanging from a peg, its end unraveling into a tuft of hemp strands that swayed slightly in the drafts. Perhaps a rusty scythe blade leaned in a corner, its edge still sharp under the patina of rust, its wooden handle missing, waiting for a repair that would never come. You could picture a pile of empty sacks, their coarse fabric folded haphazardly, smelling of grain and mice, a perfect nesting place for the small creatures that surely made their home in the loft's quiet darkness. And there might be a broken harness, its leather cracked and stiff, its brass fittings tarnished, the traces still holding the shape of the horse that had once worn it. All of these objects would be still and silent, each one coated in a fine layer of loft dust, each one a small piece of the farm's history, resting undisturbed in the darkness, waiting for a morning that was not yet due. The sense of shelter the loft provided was a palpable thing, an extra layer between your body and the sky, a wooden ceiling that closed off the vastness of the night and made the barn feel even more like a contained, protected space. Without the loft, you would be looking up at the underside of the roof, at the rafters and the thatch or the shingles, and beyond that, the cold stars and the wind and the emptiness of the heavens. The loft intercepted all of that, absorbing the chill that radiated down from the roof, holding a pocket of warm air close to the ground, trapping the heat from the bodies of the men and the slow respiration of the hay. You could feel this warmth as a slight difference in temperature when you raised your hand above your face, the air a little warmer near your chest and cooler near your upraised fingers, the loft acting as a kind of blanket, a lid that kept the barn's heat from escaping. This physical comfort translated into a deeper, emotional comfort, a feeling of being enclosed and cared for, a sense that the barn was not just a temporary shelter, but a place that had been designed over generations to keep living things safe through the long nights. The loft reminded you, in a way that was both sudden and gentle, of the barns of your own childhood, those distant structures that had seemed so immense when you were small, their lofts the setting for adventures and secret hiding places. You remembered climbing a ladder much like the one in this barn, its rungs spaced for adult legs, so that you had to stretch your short limbs to reach each one, your hands gripping the smooth wood, your bare feet finding the rounded edges. The climb had been a small act of bravery, a venture into the unknown upper world, and when you had pulled yourself onto the loft floor, you had found a kingdom of hay bales and dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the cracks in the roof. The hay bales had been stacked in a fortress-like arrangement, and you had crawled between them, finding a hollow space in the center where the hay was soft and the light was dim, a hidden room that only you knew about. The smell of that childhood loft was still with you, the same sweet, dusty smell of this barn, and the memory was so vivid that for a moment you were both here in the dark and there in the sunlight, a doubling of time that was not confusing but deeply reassuring. Those childhood lofts had been places of imagination, of escape from chores and lessons, and now, years later, a loft was still a place of escape, though the escape was from fatigue rather than from work, a retreat into stillness rather than into play. The ladder that led up to this barn's loft was somewhere off to your right, leaning against one of the main beams, and you had seen it clearly when you entered, a simple construction of two long poles with horizontal rungs set into holes drilled through the sides. The rungs were worn smooth in their centers, the wood polished by the passage of countless boots over the years, and the edges of the rungs were slightly rounded, the corners softened by use. The ladder was not fixed in place. It leaned at a steep angle, its top resting against the edge of the loft floor, its feet planted firmly on the packed earth, and it looked as though it had been in that exact position for a very long time, perhaps never moved since the day it was built. You could picture it now in the darkness, a diagonal slash of wood against the deeper darkness of the wall, its rungs a series of faint, horizontal bars that ascended into the blackness above. No one had climbed it tonight, and no one would. The loft was not needed, the hay below being sufficient for all the men, and the ladder simply stood there, a vertical road that no one traveled, its presence adding to the sense of completeness of a space fully equipped but fully at rest. Occasionally, a faint sound came from the loft, a tiny scratching or a soft, skittering noise that suggested the presence of some small creature moving through the old hay, a mouse or a swallow, its movements delicate and quick, its body so light that the sound was barely more than a whisper. The scratching would last for a few seconds, a rapid, almost musical tapping, and then it would stop, leaving the silence even deeper than before. You imagined the creature, whatever it was, pausing in its travels, its tiny ears twitching, its nose testing the air, before it continued on its way, a small, wild life that shared the barn with you, its existence as natural as the hay itself. The sound was not alarming, it was just another thread in the tapestry of barn noises, a sign that the loft was inhabited in its own quiet way, that the barn was a world complete unto itself, with layers of life from the earth floor to the roof peak. And the loft, high and dark and still, accepted all of it, the mice and the dust and the old tools holding them in its wooden embrace, keeping them safe, keeping you safe, a guardian presence that asked nothing and gave everything. A change began in the barn while you lay there suspended between memory and sleep. A change so subtle that at first it was not a change at all, but merely a suspicion. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of the darkness that you felt rather than saw. The blackness that had been absolute for so many hours, that heavy, velvet darkness that had pressed against your eyes and filled every corner, was no longer quite so absolute. It had begun to soften, not by brightening, not by admitting any visible light, but by losing a tiny fraction of its density, the way a fabric might loosen its weave after being stretched tight. You could not point to the moment when it started, nor could you describe exactly what was different, but as you lay with your eyes open, gazing up into the invisible loft, you became aware that the darkness had a new quality, a thinness at its farthest edges, a suggestion that somewhere, far beyond the barn's walls, the world was stirring. The gap in the doors, which had been a mere thread of not quite black, now seemed a shade lighter, a charcoal line against the deep black of the interior, though whether this was a real change or a trick of your adjusting eyes, you could not say. This softening of the darkness was not accompanied by any sound or movement. The barn remained as quiet as it had been all night, the men still breathing in their slow, steady rhythms, the beams still creaking occasionally, the wind still brushing against the walls. But the air itself seemed to hold a new note, a faint, crisp freshness that had not been there before, as if a window had been opened somewhere far away and a current of cooler, cleaner air was finding its way through the cracks and seams of the barn's old timbers. You felt it first on your face, a light, cool touch on your cheeks and forehead, the kind of coolness that comes not from cold, but from the absence of warmth, the coolness of the very early morning when the earth has given up its stored heat, and the sun has not yet begun to return it. This coolness carried with it a scent, the smell of damp earth and dew-soaked grass, the smell of the meadow outside awakening from its brief night's rest, and you breathed it in deeply, letting it mix with the dry sweetness of the hay and the warm wool of your greatcoat. The scent was clean and sharp, a contrast to the closed, dusty air of the barn, and it told you, without words, that the night had reached its deepest point and was now beginning its slow, inevitable turn toward morning. A rooster crowed somewhere far across the fields, a single clear call that rose out of the distance and cut through the quiet with a bright, piercing note, a sound so sudden and so full of purpose that it seemed to hang in the air for a long moment before fading away. The crow was not repeated. The rooster had announced the approaching dawn in its own time, as roosters do, and then it fell silent, leaving the silence even deeper than before, a silence that now seemed to be waiting, expectant, aware that the world was about to change. You had heard roosters crow at all hours of the night during your time as a soldier, and you knew that a single crow did not mean that the sun was about to rise. It meant only that the rooster had stirred, that some internal clock had prompted it to speak, that the long process of the dawn had begun its first, distant phase. But the sound was still a marker, a signpost in the darkness, and it gave you a sense of orientation, a small piece of information about the world beyond the barn, letting you know that the farmsteads were still there, that the animals were still keeping their ancient rhythms, that the night was progressing as it always did, slowly, patiently, toward the light. After the rooster's call, the silence that returned was different from the silence that had come before. It was a listening silence, a silence that seemed to hold its breath, and you found yourself listening too, your ears reaching out into the darkness for other signs of the approaching dawn. The wind, which had been a steady, gentle presence all night, now shifted its direction, and you could tell by the way the sound changed against the walls, the hush of moving air now coming from a different angle, pressing against a different set of planks, finding new gaps to slip through. This shift brought a fresher, cooler draft into the barn, a current of air that moved across the floor at the level of your body, stirring the loose strands of hay and carrying the outdoor scents more strongly than before. You could smell the dampness of the meadow now, a green, living smell that was different from the dry dustiness of the hay, and you could smell the faint, distant tang of wood smoke from some farmhouse where a fire had been banked for the night and was now being stirred back to life. These smells were the smells of the world waking up, the world that you would rejoin when the sun rose and the officer gave the order to move. But for now, they were still outside, still at a remove, arriving as gentle messengers that did not demand your attention. Your body, which had been slowly giving up its aches and tensions to the hay, now registered the change in the air with a small, instinctive response. The coolness on your face and hands was pleasant, but also a reminder that the warmth you had built up in your nest of hay and wool was precious, something to be conserved. You reached down without opening your eyes and found the edge of your greatcoat where it had slipped off your shoulder, and you pulled it up, tucking it more closely around your chin and ears, the coarse wool soft against your skin from long use. This small action was not a response to real cold, because the barn was still relatively warm, but it was a gesture of deep comfort, a signal to your body that you intended to remain at rest, that you were not going to rise and face the dawn just yet, that the night still held hours of darkness in which sleep could be found. The greatcoat settled around you with a soft, heavy weight, and you felt the trapped warmth of your own body reflected back at you, a cocoon of heat that the cool draughts could not penetrate, and you sank a little deeper into the hay, your muscles loosening once more after the brief tension of the movement. The men around you, your comrades in the darkness, did not stir at the rooster's call or at the shift in the wind. Their sleep was deepest at this hour, the hour before the dawn, when the body's need for rest overrides all external signals and the mind has traveled far from the surface of awareness. Their breathing had become slower and more regular as the night progressed, the initial restlessness of tired bodies having given way to the profound stillness of true, restorative sleep, and the sound of it was a deep, collective hum, a vibration that seemed to rise from the very floor of the barn and fill the space with a sense of shared peace. You could hear the man nearest to you breathing in long, slow cycles, his exhales slightly longer than his inhales, and you could hear, from somewhere across the barn, a faint, rhythmic snore, not loud or disturbing, just a soft buzzing note that rose and fell with the regularity of a clock. These sounds were more reassuring now than they had been at the beginning of the night, because they confirmed that you were all still there, still safe, still resting, that the night had held no alarms, that the approaching dawn would find you whole and ready. Your own breathing had slowed to match the rhythm of those around you, and your thoughts, which had been drifting through the fragments of the day's march, now became even more diffuse, settling into a quiet, dreamlike state that was not quite sleep, but was no longer full wakefulness. The images that passed through your mind were no longer memories, but something softer, something closer to imagination, pictures of fields in the early morning, of mist rising from a stream, of the first light touching the tops of trees, images that were not seen so much as sensed, their colors muted, their edges blurred, like a painting viewed through a veil of gauze. You did not hold on to any of these images or try to shake them into a narrative. You simply observed them as they drifted by, each one a small, peaceful vignette that had no connection to the one before or after, a gentle slideshow of the mind at rest. The approaching dawn was seeping into your consciousness not as a thought but as a feeling, a quiet anticipation that was free of urgency, the knowledge that the world would soon wake up, but that you were not required to wake with it, not yet. The darkness continued its slow retreat, though it was still the dominant presence in the barn, still the medium in which you floated. The gaps in the walls were now slightly more visible, their lines a little more distinct, and you could see, if you looked carefully, the faint outline of the doors as a rectangular shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the outside. The wooden partition near you, which had been a mere shadow among shadows, now had a faint edge to it, a thin line of deep grey that marked where the top of the planks met the air, and the pack with your tricorn hat on it was now a more defined silhouette, its shape clearer, its corners sharper, though it was still just a block of darkness against the wall. These changes were so gradual that you could not see them happening. They were like the movement of the minute hand on a clock, invisible in the moment but undeniable over time, and they gave the barn a sense of slow, steady progression, a quiet countdown to the sunrise that no one was watching but everyone could feel. The hay beneath you, which had been a warm, dry nest all night, now felt slightly cooler at its surface, the chill of the early morning air having penetrated the outer layer of stalks, though the deeper hay was still warm from your body's stored heat. You shifted slightly, pressing your back more firmly into the pile, and the hay responded with a soft, muffled crunch, releasing a puff of its sweet, dusty scent that mixed with the fresh smell of the dawn. The combination of these two scents, the closed-in sweetness of the stored hay and the open-air freshness of the meadow, was the scent of the barn at this particular hour, a scent that existed only in the transition between night and day, and you breathed it in as if it were a rare and precious thing, a perfume that would be gone as soon as the sun rose and the doors were opened and the world flooded back in. A second rooster crowed, this one closer than the first, perhaps from a farm just across the nearest field, and its call was louder and sharper, a bright, brassy sound that seemed to echo off the barn's walls for a moment before fading. This time the crow was answered by another, even more distant, the faint, thin note that barely reached your ears, and then a third, somewhere off to the east, their calls overlapping and separating like a round sung by untrained voices. The roosters were waking up across the countryside, each one announcing the dawn in its own time, their calls a chain of sound that stretched from farm to farm, a rustic clock that needed no winding. You listened to this chorus with a sense of deep detachment, as if it were happening in another world, a world that you were not yet required to inhabit, and the sounds washed over you without disturbing the quiet center of your rest. The roosters were doing their duty, just as you had done yours, and their calls were a reminder that the world was orderly, that the cycles continued, that the dawn would come whether you watched for it or not. The sky outside, which you could not see but could imagine through the gaps in the walls, was beginning to change from the deep starless black of the cloudy night to a slightly lighter shade of grey, a diffuse pearly grey that had no source, no bright spot on the horizon, just a general lightening of the entire dome of heaven. This grey light was still too faint to penetrate the barn in any meaningful way, but it was there, pressing against the walls, finding every crack and knothole, sending thin, tentative fingers of illumination into the darkness. One of these fingers reached through the knot in the wall that you had noticed earlier, and the pinprick of light that had been a tiny, distant star was now a tiny, distant pearl, a dot of cool, silvery grey that seemed to float in the darkness like a single, unblinking eye. You watched this dot for a long moment, letting your gaze rest on it without focusing, and it seemed to pulse very slightly, a slow, rhythmic pulse that was probably just the movement of your own blood in your eye, but it was a companionable presence, a small, steady point of light that connected you to the world outside. The loft above you, which had been a zone of absolute darkness all night, now began to reveal the faintest hints of its structure, not details, but suggestions, a slight differentiation in the blackness where the beams crossed, a vague sense of depth where the platform ended and the open space of the barn began. You could not see the hay bales or the old tools or the rake with the broken tooth, but you could feel the loft's presence more clearly now, its solid weight hanging over you, its role as a barrier between the barn's interior and the roof becoming more apparent as the light slowly increased. The loft had been a guardian of the darkness, and now it was becoming a guardian of the twilight, holding back the dawn so that you could have a few more minutes, a few more hours of this quiet, suspended time before the day began. Your body, which had been in a state of deep relaxation, now stirred with a small, distant awareness of the coming day, a faint, pre-conscious recognition that rest would not last forever, that the march would resume, that the road was still waiting. But this awareness did not disturb you. It was simply a fact, a small, quiet note in the symphony of your thoughts, and you acknowledged it without engaging with it, letting it drift past like all the other images and sensations. You were still tired, your muscles still heavy, your mind still slow, and the approaching dawn was not a command but a gentle suggestion, an invitation that you were free to decline for as long as you wished. The officer had said first light, and first light had not yet arrived, and even when it did, there would be the slow process of waking, of gathering equipment, of forming up, a process that would take time, that would give you more minutes in the hay, more minutes of this deep, sweet stillness before the world claimed you back. You turned onto your side, curling your knees up slightly and tucking your hands under your chin, and the hay adjusted around you with a series of soft, crackling sounds, accommodating this new shape, cradling you in its dry embrace. Your grey coat followed the movement, its wool heavy and warm, and you felt a deep, abiding comfort that seemed to rise up from the earth itself, a comfort that was made of hay and darkness and the breathing of your comrades and the distant promise of a dawn that was taking its time, a dawn that was in no hurry to arrive. Your eyes fell closed, and the darkness behind your lids was the same as the darkness of the barn, but now it was a darkness that held a hint of grey. A soft, muted light that was the herald of the morning, a light that you could ignore, that you could push away, that you could let wash over you without drawing you up from the depths of your rest. The approaching dawn was a gentle tide, and you were floating on it, weightless and still, suspended between the night that was ending and the day that had not yet begun, and there was nothing you needed to do, nowhere you needed to be, except here, in this barn, in this hay, in this quiet, endless moment before the sun rose. The final moments before sleep were not a sudden falling, but a slow fading, a gentle erosion of the boundary between wakefulness and rest, and you drifted toward it without any sense of crossing a line. Your breathing had found its own deep, steady rhythm long ago, each inhale drawing the cool, hay-scented air into your lungs, each exhale releasing it in a soft, warm stream that stirred the loose strands near your lips, and now that rhythm became the entire world, a tide that rose and fell with a patient oceanic certainty. The rise of your chest was a slow, deliberate motion, the wool of your coat stretching slightly over your ribs, and the fall was even slower, a sinking back into the hay that seemed to take more weight with it each time, as if your body were becoming heavier, denser, more a part of the barn's earthen floor. You did not count your breaths or try to control them. You simply let them happen, each one a small, self-contained event that required nothing of you. And the more you let go, the more the breathing seemed to breathe itself, an automatic, ancient function that had been running since your first cry and would continue until your last, asking no permission, needing no guidance. The sounds of the barn, which had been a distinct tapestry of creaks and rustles and distant calls, now began to dissolve into a single continuous hum, a background drone that had no separate parts and no discernible source. The breathing of your comrades, each man with his own tempo and depth, had merged into a collective sound, a soft, sighing chorus that wrapped around you like a blanket of air, and you could no longer tell where one sleeper's exhale ended and another's began. The creaking of the beams which had punctuated the night with its slow wooden voice now seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound so deeply woven into the barn's fabric that it was indistinguishable from the silence itself. The wind, still brushing against the walls, had become a mere whisper, a faint, shushing note that was less a sound and more a feeling, a gentle pressure on your eardrums that soothed rather than alerted. Even the distant roosters, which had called out the approaching dawn, now fell quiet, or their calls were absorbed into the hum, their bright, sharp notes blunted by the thickness of the barn's walls and the deepening fog of your own drowsiness. All of these sounds were still there, still happening, but your mind had stopped separating them, stopped analyzing them, and they flowed together into a single, seamless stream of quiet, a stream that carried you gently forward, away from the shore of awareness. Your thoughts, which had been drifting in fragments for some time, now became even softer and more disjointed, losing their shape entirely until they were no longer thoughts at all but mere impressions, faint colors and textures that floated through the darkness behind your closed eyes without forming any recognizable image. The memory of the road, which had been so vivid earlier, was now a distant grey blur, a sense of motion rather than a specific place, and you could not have said where the march had begun or where it had ended, only that there had been a road and that you had walked it. The face of the old woman at the gate, which had lingered so clearly in your mind, now dissolved into a simple shape, a pale oval with dark eyes that were no longer looking at you but through you, into some distance that you could not perceive. The taste of the stream water, which had been cold and sharp in your memory, was now just a faint coolness on your tongue, a ghost of a sensation that came and went without any connection to thirst or drinking. The poplar trees, the dust, the bread, the hawk, all of them had faded into a soft, indistinct wash, a watercolor painting left out in the rain, its colors bleeding into one another until there was no tree, no bird, no bread, just a gentle, diffuse impression of a day that had been long and full and was now completely, irrevocably over. Your body, which had spoken so clearly of its aches and fatigues, now fell silent as well, its voice replaced by a deep, pervasive heaviness that seemed to sink you further into the hay with every passing moment. The soreness in your feet, which had throbbed with such insistence, was now a distant, muffled warmth, a sensation so remote that it might have belonged to someone else, a soldier lying in a different barn in a different night. The tightness in your calves and thighs had melted into a formless softness, the muscles no longer holding any tension, no longer remembering the miles they had carried you, and your legs felt as though they were made of something dense and warm, something that was slowly merging with the hay beneath them. Your lower back, which had been a hollow vessel of strain, was now simply a part of you that was resting, its ache transformed into a dull, pleasant glow that radiated outward into your hips and sides, a glow that was indistinguishable from the warmth of the wool coat and the trapped heat of your body. Your shoulders, released from the weight of the musket and the crossbelts, had dropped into a position of complete surrender, the bones settling into the hay as if they had found their true home, and your arms lay heavy and inert, your hands open and relaxed, the fingers slightly curled as if holding something invisible and precious. Even your face, which had been clenched and focused for so many hours, was now completely slack, the jaw loose, the brow smooth, the eyelids resting so gently over your eyes that they seemed to float rather than press. The sensation of your body as a single, unified entity was fading. It was becoming a collection of parts, each one heavy and warm and separate, each one sinking into the hay at its own pace, and the boundary between your flesh and the straw was growing thinner, less distinct, until you could not quite tell where you ended and the barn began. The hay itself seemed to respond to this dissolution, accepting your weight more completely, shaping itself around you with a patient, granular embrace. The stalks that had prickled and rustled now lay still and quiet, their sharp edges softened by the warmth of your body and the long hours of compression, and the mound you had shaped for a pillow had molded itself to the exact curve of your head and neck, cradling you with a gentle, yielding firmness. The loose strands that had tickled your cheek were now pressed flat, their tips no longer reaching your skin, and the hay beneath your back had conformed to the contours of your spine and shoulders, filling every hollow and supporting every curve, a custom-made bed that had been formed not by design, but by the simple, patient pressure of your resting body. The smell of the hay, which had been so complex and layered, was now a single, unified scent, a warm, sweet, dusty perfume that you breathed in without noticing, that had become the very atmosphere of your small world, and the faint, fresh coolness of the approaching dawn that seeped through the cracks was a distant, secondary note, a mere hint of the outside that could not compete with the deep, enveloping sweetness of the stored summer grass. The darkness, too, had changed its character, becoming less a separate thing and more a quality of your own inner state. The faint lightning that had marked the approaching dawn was still there, a soft grey presence at the edges of your perception, but it no longer signified morning or waking or the resumption of the march. It was simply a lighter shade of darkness, a gentle pearly dimness that flowed around you without illuminating anything, a darkness that was not dark at all but a kind of visual quiet, a rest for the eyes that had seen too much road and sky. The shapes that you had traced in the gloom, the pack, the hat, the partition, the ladder, had all dissolved back into the general dimness, and there was nothing left to look at, nothing that required your gaze or your attention, just a smooth, featureless field of shadow that was the perfect backdrop for a mind that was no longer interested in seeing. Your eyes, which had been open or closed or something in between, were now definitively closed, the lids heavy and immovable, the lashes resting softly on your cheeks, and the small muscles around your eyes were completely relaxed. The tension of focusing and tracking and watching finally fully released. In this state, the line between awareness and dreaming grew so thin that it was no longer a line at all, but a gradual blending, a merging of two states that were not opposites but neighbors, sharing a border that was porous and undefined. You were still aware of the hay beneath you, but you were also aware of a field of hay that was not this barn, a field that stretched away under a summer sun, its grasses rippling in a warm breeze, and the two sensations overlapped without conflict, the real hay and the imagined hay becoming a single golden presence. You were still aware of the breathing of your comrades, but you were also aware of a different kind of breathing, a vast, slow respiration that seemed to belong to the barn itself, to the earth, to the night sky, and the sound was both inside your ears and outside them, a universal rhythm that you had joined without effort. You were still aware of your own body, but you were also aware of being without a body, of floating in a warm, dark sea that supported you without pressure, and the two sensations were not contradictory but complementary, two ways of experiencing the same deep, abiding peace. The boundary between self and world, between inside and outside, between now and then, was softening, blurring, becoming a gentle gradient rather than a sharp divide, and you drifted along this gradient with no destination, no direction, just a slow, aimless movement that was the essence of letting go. The weight of your uniform, which had been a constant presence all night, was now just a part of the general heaviness, the wool coat and the cross belts and the gaiters melding into a single, comfortable pressure that held you without confining you. The strip of cloth in your collar, that small, personal buffer against the stiff wool, was a tiny point of softness against your neck, a detail so small that it barely registered, and the brass buttons on your waistcoat had warmed to the temperature of your skin, their cool metal no longer distinguishable from the warmth of your chest. The great coat, pulled close around your chin, was a soft, heavy blanket that smelled of wool and road dust and your own sleeping body, and it wrapped you in a familiar, reassuring embrace that was the last physical sensation you could identify before the physical began to fade altogether. Your hands, still curled loosely in front of your chest, were no longer hands, but simply warm, quiet presences, and your feet, still encased in their boots, were no longer feet, but distant, muffled weights, and your head, resting on its hay pillow, was no longer a head but a calm, floating sphere of dim awareness that was slowly filling with a soft, grey mist. Time, which had been a steady, measured progression all night, now lost its meaning entirely, dissolving into a single, eternal present that had no past and no future, no beginning and no end. The hours that had passed, the hours that remained until dawn, the hours that would come after, all of them were abstractions, concepts that had no purchase in this drifting, timeless state, and you had no need for them, no curiosity about them, no desire to measure or count or plan. There was only this moment, this breath, this soft, deep stillness, and the moment was infinite, stretching out in all directions, a warm, dark ocean that had no shores and no depths, a place where nothing was required and everything was allowed. The march, the road, the company, the war, the whole vast machinery of your life as a soldier, all of it was still there, waiting for you in the morning, but it was held at a distance, suspended in a bubble of time that would not burst until the sun rose, and the officer's voice called you back. For now, for this endless, fleeting moment, you were not a soldier, but simply a man at rest, a creature of breath and warmth and hay, a small, peaceful presence in a dark barn in a quiet corner of the world, and that was enough. The sensation of sinking which had been with you all night as the hay accepted your weight now became something more, a deeper, slower descent that was not physical but mental, a gentle, inexorable slide into a place where thought ceased and awareness dissolved and only the most basic primal functions remained. You were not falling, not in the way that falling implies speed and danger. You were submerging, lowering yourself inch by inch into a warm, dark lake that closed over your head without a ripple. And the water of this lake was made of silence and stillness and the accumulated rest of all the men who had ever slept in this barn before you, their weariness and their peace soaking into the timbers and the hay and the earth, creating a reservoir of calm that you were now joining. The slide was so slow and so gentle that you could not feel it happening, could not mark its progress, could not say where you were along its course. You only knew that you were moving, that each breath took you a little deeper, that each release of tension was a step further from the shore of waking, and that there was no need to resist, no need to hold on, no need to do anything but let the current carry you. Your mind, which had been a quiet observer of this entire process, now began to withdraw its observation, turning inward and downward, retreating from the surface of consciousness like a tide pulling away from a beach, leaving behind a smooth, empty expanse of wet sand that gleamed faintly in the last light of awareness. The images that had been floating through your thoughts, the fields and the trees and the old woman and the stream, all receded into the distance, becoming smaller and smaller until they were mere specks, pinpricks of light that winked out one by one, and then there was nothing but the darkness, a deep, featureless darkness that was not empty, but full of a quiet, waiting presence that was the sleep itself. The darkness was warm, warmer than the barn, warmer than the hay, warmer than your own body, and it wrapped around you like a second greatcoat, a greatcoat woven from night and silence and the accumulated peace of the hours, and you pulled it close, tucking it under your chin, settling into its embrace with a long, slow, final exhale. The last thread of awareness, the thin, silvery thread that had connected you to the barn and the men and the approaching dawn, now stretched and thinned and finally parted, so gently that there was no snap, no break, just a quiet release, a letting go that was the most natural thing in the world. You did not feel it happen, you did not mark the moment when wakefulness ended and sleep began, because there was no moment, no boundary, no line that could be crossed. There was only a gradual, seamless transition, a fading of one state into another, like the fading of the evening into night or the night into dawn. A change that was happening all around you and within you, so slow and so complete that you were already deep in its embrace before you could even think to name it. The barn held you, the hay cradled you, the darkness wrapped you, and the breathing of your comrades was a distant, rhythmic lullaby that rocked you gently, steadily, ceaselessly, as you drifted where the night took you, no longer a soldier, no longer a man, no longer anything but a quiet, sleeping presence in a hay barn before dawn.